If you or someone you know has a story, encounter, or experience you would like to share with my viewers, please send it to my email at stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. Thank you. I was driving home from work on a 6-lane highway, heading west into Hamilton, Ontario. As I drove on my side of the highway, I saw a dog cross from the left side to the right. That area is full of trees, bushes, channels, and ravines of water that are offshoots of the lake. When I saw the dog, it was approximately half of a kilometer ahead of me. The astonishing aspect of this dog, well, I'm certain it was a dog, was its length from nose to rump, excluding its tail, covered the almost full width of the lane, which is 8 feet where it was heading, was back into a small valley filled with heavy forestation and another ravine. I couldn't believe a dog could actually grow to that size. I still remind my boyfriend of this occasionally. About 3 years ago, I encountered what I could only explain then as a deformed hyena. It was in the later part of the day, under dusky conditions, and I was small game hunting at the time. I did not feel any fear because I was carrying my over-under shotgun at the time. Its eyes were kind of strange, I remember, and it had very pointy ears. Its head was almost cartoon-like as its snout had messed up overgrown hair. Its fangs looked unusually long as well. For some time before I seen it, I heard a very, very long coughing noise, like a cat coughing up a fur ball. However, this went on for a long time, so whatever did had strong and large lung capacity. I doubt a lynx or cat could have been the noisemaker. I have no idea if this dog-like creature was the source of the strange and long coughing fit. Another strange thing along this trail, I always seem to be under the watchful eyes of a flying turkey vulture. Now, these are newcomers to Alberta, but a few mating pairs have been reported up here, and this is common local knowledge that no one questions. This coughing bout I have heard at least once before in this specific area. Never seen this source in the nearby dense boreal forest. This wooded area is kind of on the edge of an oil exploration, and is an active work area now, so I don't hunt there anymore. Which all in all is too bad, as it's chock full of small game, such as rabbits. During this encounter, the woods were unnaturally quiet. It's hard to move in many areas off trail because the evergreen limbs reach so far close to the ground. An upright person would be stooped over to move any kind of speed in many areas. Quadrupeds have a definite advantage here over people, and the area is also ridged with swamps and marshy, very uneven ground that one can easily turn your ankle on. There were other strange moments then. I think when I did see this animal, I sat down on a large rock with my gun across my lap and caught the first glimpse as it was circling me. I think to catch my scent on the wind. I just caught a glimpse of it passing behind a tree in the dusky light conditions. It had hocks like a dog, but as it came around the tree, still on all 4 legs, I noticed the front legs were longer than the back legs. Its back legs bowed upward, and I got the distinct impression its frontal back, chest, and leg muscles were much more pronounced and muscular than its back legs. I believe the front coat was a lighter color, with some reddish tones too. It looked like a hyena loose in North America to my very own eyes. It was not a black bear. I'm very familiar with bears. It was canine-like, but not any canine I have ever seen before or since. My brother, who was not there, found a near-perfect picture of another critter online, on another crypto site, and the picture was said to be taken near the very same Wisconsin River. In the picture, it looked like it was on a farmland corral or fence line, in the early spring because of the white and light snow cover, and it was near twin to what I saw that fall evening in Alberta. If you're looking for this picture, simply Google it to see what I'm talking about. I saw something that put a big scare into me. I'm going to describe it. I'm not sure you'll believe it, but I'm certain about what I saw that day. This happened in August 2009, as I was driving to my husband's place of employment. We live in Gillam, Manitoba, and he is an electrician for one of the generating stations on the river. It was close to 3 p.m. I had just turned off one of the residential roads near my home, ending east on PR 280. About a half a mile after my turn, I caught a glimpse of something tall moving through the trees to my right. Then, suddenly, it jumped onto the shoulder of the road and stood there as I drove by. I looked in the mirror and saw it quickly cross to the other side of the road. I picked up speed and did not stop until I reached the station. I had chills all over. I got a decent look at it. It had a large wolf head, but it was standing upright on legs which looked man-like. I didn't see arms as I passed by, but I did see arms swaying back and forth when I looked in the mirror as it crossed the road. The coloring of the head and body hair was charcoal with darker patches. It was an actual gray wolf, then it was one of the largest ones I had ever heard of. I thought that somebody was playing tricks, but that wouldn't make any sense since it was during hunting season. I did tell my husband, who later checked the area where I saw it. He said that there were reports of a very large wolf along the river a year or two before, but he had not heard of anything beyond that. I still don't know if he believes me. I also said something to my uncle through marriage, who is Chippewa. My uncle told me that it was not a wolf and that I must forget about it. He then recited some words under his breath and told me not to mention it again. That kind of freaked me out. Since it was 5 years ago, I haven't thought much of it until I read a newspaper article about the Dogman and sightings people had in other locations. My Dogman encounter happened on a season opener in November of 2013 in the eastern upper peninsula of Michigan on family hunting property near a town called Cedarville. The house my husband and I were staying up there in had a big front yard, but other than that, the cleared area and the gravel driveway, everything else is pretty deep hardwood forest. I also want to state ahead of time that this happened at around 11 p.m. at night. So everything that's beyond the porch lights was pretty hard to see. My husband and I had gone outside to have a cigarette, and we took our rifle out with us whenever we were hanging around outside, because there's bear and stuff back there in that area. I was up on the porch still, and my husband had gone down the steps into the yard and was facing towards me when we heard these really heavy, slow footsteps coming up the driveway through the woods. It sounded like a really big man, but there was this weird heavy breathing to it, and the footsteps, even though they sounded like a person, sounded heavier than anything I had ever heard walking in the woods, including full-sized adult bears. My husband looked at me and mouthed, "What the fuck?" And I was trying to figure out what it was that I was hearing, but nothing I had ever heard out there in those woods in my whole life matched the size and breathing and gait of whatever this was, so I was confused and shaking my head. My husband isn't a hunter and grew up in the city, so he was completely confused. I've hunted and tracked basically everything that's indigenous to northern Michigan since I was so small, and I was honestly terrified that this animal was completely unknown to me by sound. It walked out of the tree line at the edge of the yard behind my husband, and it was a lot taller than him, at least 7 feet tall or more, and I'd estimate the weight for its size at around 400 pounds. It was on 2 legs and had super dark black fur that was somehow even darker than the nighttime dark of the woods. It was walking back and forth at that distance from us the whole time this encounter happened, but it would not step into where the perimeter of the porch light was. I had a really hard time making out its torso for that reason, but I saw a wolf-like head and snout with pointed ears that stuck straight up, and instead of front legs and paws, it had really disproportionately long arms and hands. It was on 2 legs this whole time, walking back and forth. I freaked out and grabbed the rifle and just started shooting at it and yelling at my husband to run and get up on the porch. So he did, and then he took the gun from me and told me to find something to use as a weapon and to go inside and to hide. So I did. I got a big knife and went to lock myself in our bedroom, in the closet, and could hear my husband shooting and reloading a bunch for about another 10 minutes. He came in and told me through the closet door that the Dogman had finally run off, but he wasn't sure if it was going to possibly come back, so we were both pretty terrified, and I ended up staying in that closet all night until sunrise with my husband, guarding the door with the gun. He told me that he thought I had hit it when I was shooting at it first, but then the next day, we didn't find any blood or hair or anything, which I thought was weird, because I really thought I must have shot it and wounded it at least a couple of times. It moved incredibly fast though, and was agile enough to run through the brush and stuff, without really mowing it down or making a bunch of noise, like big animals usually do, running through weird dense underbrush. The whole encounter was incredibly weird and scary. My husband also said that he did see it sort of hunch over and drop down onto all fours a few times, while it was running back and forth at the edge of the yard. But that was when it ran away for good that night, that it was running insanely fast on two legs like a man. We didn't see or smell anything bad like a lot of people describe when they see these things. It didn't even leave any noticeable tracks anywhere, even though the thing was so heavy when it was walking up the gravel driveway that I swore the ground near it must have been shaking. We found out later from one of the neighbors that had seen it too, next door, the winter before, when it came up the porch of his cabin and looked in the door window during a party he and his wife had been throwing. He said he heard a really heavy footstep on the porch and pulled back the curtain on the window, and the Dogman was standing there on the other side of the glass looking down at him, but that its fur was white then. I think that's probably because there was snow on the ground at that point of the year. My neighbor hollered at everyone in the cabin and told them what he had just seen, and then everyone decided to make a run for it through the woods to his mom's house next door, since her place was a lot sturdier than the hunting cabin. I've known that neighbor my whole life, practically since high school, and he would never make something up like that. He was scared even while he was just talking about it. I also read somewhere online recently that another family, about 45 miles north of our area, had a bunch of livestock like cows and horses turn up dead and torn up by some kind of big predator, and that one of the guys in the family saw a giant upright wolf back near his hunting blind spot during deer season, which of course freaked me out since we had our experience on season opener. The land butting up to that family's property is hundreds of miles of the national forest, so it would make sense to me that a big animal would hide in and near a protected area like that when it's hearing gunshots everywhere else. My lot and my neighbor's lot are also alongside state land. My husband and I moved since this all happened, but the experience was so upsetting to me that I constantly research online to see if anyone else has seen this thing up north and what their encounter was like. I've even heard that there's a small pack of about 4 or 5 of them that live in the state forest downstate in Isabella County, and that a bunch of locals in the nearby area have seen, and that somebody even saw one at nighttime in downtown Michigan. What scares me about that is the fact that there's no tree cover there, as that's a city. I wonder if people all over the state are seeing these animals because they're getting forced out of their usual hunting territories due to hunting, logging, mining, and that's really all increased over the years. If anyone else from Michigan has had an experience, please, I would love to hear it. I'm a vet student. My university is on top of a hill and outside of town. From my dorm window, which is on the 7th floor, I can see huge wheat fields and the nearby forest. My first encounter was 2 years ago. I have a German Shepherd, who I call Hades, and a Husky puppy, which I call Ragnar. The day I left university quite late. It was already dark outside. Usually I don't mind taking them out at night. At night I can let them run without their leashes. They are trained and I know they are going to listen to me. Besides, I knew everyone else knew them and wouldn't hurt them even if they were outside. They have collars that light up since Hades is fully black and Ragnar is fully white, which makes it hard to see him during the winter. I could see them running all around the time. We walked for a while and they were playing and running around. At some point though, Hades stopped and started growling, looking into the wheat fields down the hill. I didn't really think about it. There were bats, owls, and other critters around us. I leashed them, not wanting to run after them if they decided to chase something. After an hour and a half of non-stop growling, I have had enough of it and decided to take Hades home and go out so Ragnar can run a bit more. I got home and expected him to go in his cage. He likes sleeping in there after all. That night though, all he did was stand at the window looking out. Since the pup was whining, wanting to go out again, I tried to drag Hades in the cage and lock him in until I got back. Who knew, maybe he might try going out the window. I got to look out the window. On the parking below, I saw a black figure circling the cars. Thinking that it might be someone trying to steal, I got a flashlight and shone at it. It wasn't a thief. It wasn't a human at all. It looked up, and its eyes reflecting the light from the flashlight. It was black, its head looking very similar to Hades. It was standing on all fours, but when I shone the light, it stood up. The roofs of the cars were barely reaching its midsection. It let out a growl, which I later learned that many of the tenants have heard. Hades went wild trying to bust out of the cage. Ragnar was whining even louder. I realized he didn't want to go out though. He was trying to get as far away from the window as possible. The growl made me flinch, and I dropped the flashlight through the window. I tried to see it again, but it was too dark. I heard the crunching of snow as it left. The next morning, I went to find my flashlight and found a huge dog-like footprint in the snow and a foul smell still lingering. I borrowed infrared binoculars from a hunter friend of mine. Ever since then, I have seen it in the forest, crossing the field and coming near the hill, looking up. I and my roommate have been taking turns keeping watch at night when Hades starts growling. I don't take the dogs out at night, and Ragnar doesn't play and run around anymore. He just stays pressed against my feet. When I first took this job to be an over-the-road trucker, I thought it would be really exciting. I thought I'd get to travel the country and see the sights and come home with stories to tell my friends and family. I was right. This job is exciting, but I soon found out that I'm better off not sharing these stories with anyone close to me. Not because I don't trust them, but because I'm worried that they wouldn't believe me. Let me back up. My name is Brittany. I'm 22 years old and I've been driving with a rather large company now for a few months. I won't name due to obvious reasons though. Ever since my training ended and I got my own truck to start solo, I've seen some pretty weird stuff. When you are driving the loneliest road in America, yes, that is a real name, in the middle of nowhere, Nevada, things can start to get to you. I suppose it was only a matter of time before I saw something out in the desert at nearly midnight. I still had another hour to the nearest truck stop, and blasting the freezing cold air against my face was all I could do to keep myself from dozing off at the wheel. Irresponsible, I know, but until you work this job, you don't understand how much lax comes with it. I was driving this highway in the desert in the pitch blackness of a cold summer night, when suddenly, something runs out in the road in front of me. Before I can even react, it's gone across the other side into the bushes. I barely even got a good look at it, but I could have sworn it looked like a large white dog, faster than any dog I've ever seen. I try to just ignore it and keep driving. I see animals crossing the road at night all the time. It didn't seem like anything to get worked up about. Not even a minute later, I feel my truck lurch to the left and into the other lane. I quickly try to swerve and correct it, and easily step on the brakes so I don't wreck. It could be easy to jackknife an 80,000-pound metal death machine. I slow it down and regain control. I looked for the nearest pullover spot so I could see what the hell just hit my rig, and see if there's any damage. Once I find a spot and turn off, hit my brakes and hop out. I walk around to the other side and see a large dent in the side of my trailer. What in the hell? I say to myself as I walk over to inspect the side of the trailer. It's a huge dent, at least 5 feet wide and tall. No real shape to it, just a general dent. I can't imagine what could have hit me. My first thought was maybe a boulder rolled down from the side of the hill and smashed into me, but I didn't think I was driving next to any hills or mountains. As far as I knew, it was just flat desert. I hear the sound of dirt crunching under footfall behind me, and I turn around. My breath catches in my throat, and my stomach drops as I see something standing not even 50 feet away from me. It's large, menacing, and white. I can't even find the words to describe what this thing looked like. It looked like a very large dog, and that's a stretch. It stood on 2 legs, stout legs, with long forearms reaching down past its knees. Its shoulders were broad and heaving, as if it had just ran a marathon. Its head was mostly shaped like a wolf, with a large snout filled with razor-sharp teeth bared in a snarl, saliva dripping from its maw. Its jet-black eyes bore right through me, filled with hatred and hunger. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place. This creature stood between me and my only salvation, my truck. We stared at one another for a moment until I broke the silence. "You are one ugly motherfucker," I said. It snarled at me. Then, very unexpectedly, it turned and walked away slowly, using all four of its limbs, receding into the bushes and into the night. I stood there for what felt like several minutes, wondering if it ever would jump back out and feed on my flesh at any moment. It never came back. I ran around the front of my truck and jumped inside, locking the door quickly and flooring it, as fast as you can floor an 18-wheeler, which is not at all. Soon, I was back on the highway and barreling down it as if my life depended on it. For a while, it felt like it did. Within a half hour, I found myself at the truck stop and shut down for the night. Sleep was difficult that night. I was certain every noise I heard was that damn creature returning. Luckily, though, the night went on without another incident. I have more stories to tell, but this is getting long, so I'll stop here. Remember, everybody, be careful out there on the road. You never know what else is out there with you. I can never look at the woods the same again after that night. You see, I was a man of the woods. I would camp and enjoy the wildlife alone. One time, I decided to bring my wife along. We were deep walking along the edges of the mountains. A river ran wide and for miles. As time got near dark, we set up the tent and then held each other by the fire that we started. Soon, though, the sky started to get gray and rain fell. As we slept in the tent, I was having a hard time staying asleep, so I decided to unzip the tent from the bottom and look out a little to sleep for a little bit. On the other hand, my wife was passed out and was a hard sleeper. I guess she just felt safe. As I look outside, I was just seeing woods and a grass opening just beyond that. There was no moon out that night, but the stars were. For a while, things seemed normal until I could start to see some type of thing dragging a deer with its insides hanging out of its stomach. This thing looked to be tall and was skinny and hairy. Its arms was long and its claws swung to its waist as it dragged the deer. It looked like a wolf walking on two legs, or like a Dogman thing, they say. It was hideous. Its mouth was naturally open, showing its nasty teeth. This thing released the deer on the ground and started to feed. I could hear it growl in odd vocal sounds as it ripped off the flesh and ate. It then looked up with its green eyes, seeing me peek in the corner of the tent. Not moving its eyes, it just looked at me, eating the deer, and then slowly stepped back and faded into the dark woods. I remained in fear and questioned all night, wondering if it was going to come back, but it never did. Finally, morning came and I rushed us out of the woods. My wife knew something was wrong because I didn't talk much. We made it out and haven't been back in the woods since. My wife has no idea what I saw that night, and I will never tell her. What really gets me is I was just about to go outside of the tent and walk for a moment. I wonder how things would have played out if he came and seen me out of the tent, or even worse, got to my wife when I simply could have been a few feet away. I'll never camp again now that I know what's really going on in the woods. Around 2002, I was about 6 and traveling around coastal rural Ireland with my uncle. We parked the caravan on a beach underneath a cliff face, and it started to get dark. We decided to rest up for the night. I can't remember the time, but I woke up later on in the night. It was pitch black outside. The caravan was very warm and cramped, so I decided to get some fresh air. There were several others in the caravan, but they were all definitely asleep. As I got out of bed and headed towards the door, I noticed it was already open slightly, and what I seen is still seared into me this day. I seen what I can only be described as a bipedal dog or a dog man. Like many descriptions I've read, the creature was around 6 to 7 feet. It dwarfed me entirely. It had a pronounced snout, matted black fur, a human-like frame, but I believe it was wearing some kind of robe or rags. Its eyes were this iridescent, hypnotic, and terrifying yellow color, almost glowing in the darkness. I did not get a good look at its feet or legs. Now this is where the story takes a turn. The creature spoke to me. Whatever this thing was, it was trying to communicate. The creature itself was making a series of low, guttural, rhythmic growls. However, I was able to interpret these as words, whilst the entity was growling. I heard a low, booming voice inside my head. I can't remember word for word what it said, but it mentioned death almost exclusively throughout the conversation. The creature didn't move, and I couldn't stop looking into its eyes for the duration of this encounter. The encounter rounded off with me breaking eye contact and curling up in a ball of hysterics. The creature left almost instantaneously, and my uncle woke up shortly afterwards. I tried to explain, but of course he didn't believe me. I had stayed at my friend's place by Lansing for a couple of weeks and decided to take off and head towards the shore of Lake Michigan, up through Petoskey and over the peninsula. It was dark by the time I got to Pentwater, a small resort town on the shore of Lake Michigan in the western part of the state. I was kind of confused at a stop sign and lurched to a stop, started and stopped. I looked up and there was a police officer stopped to my right. I decided to make a right turn, then turn into a neighborhood. I made my way back to the main road and took a right. As I turned back on the main road, I saw a small hill going up into a wooded area on the left. I saw some sort of animal in the grassy area between the road and the trees. I thought to myself, oh cool, I'm going to get to see some wildlife, like a possum or a badger. But as I got near it, it seemed to move in a very unnatural way for an animal like that. Sort of too fast and too jerky as it ran to the side and then down the hill. It appeared to be brown and reddish tobacco colored and furry. It looked much larger too, more like human size. After I passed it, I looked up in my rear view. The animal had stood up on its hind legs and ran across the street, leaning over with its front arms hanging down. Classic werewolf-type horror movie pose. I had been planning on camping out in that area, but no way. I drove over 2 hours before I stopped finally. If you or someone you know has a story, encounter, or experience you would like to share with my viewers, please send it to my email at stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. Thank you. I grew up in a hollow in a pretty small town in rural West Virginia. The hollow is roughly 3 miles long, but surrounded by family-owned forest land, at least 10 acres or more deep in every direction. The only homes located on the hollow were all family. We lived in the very last house on the road. We were the dead end of the road, and our closest neighbor was an uncle, about 200 yards down a field. My brother and I grew up very poor, so we spent most of our free time outside, roaming the woods and whatnot. I remember so many times wandering around in the woods when it would just fall silent around us. Birds suddenly stopped chirping. Little animals stopped rustling in the leaves. Just complete silence. We always took that as our own personal signal to head home, like the woods were saying, "That's enough for today." As kids, we never thought much of it, but now, recounting this story, it definitely makes sense. My brother and I grew up apart as we went to middle school, so we didn't spend a lot of time together in the woods anymore, and mostly stayed in our own rooms like preteens do. One evening, though, our parents decided to go out for a little bit, and leaving my brother and I with nothing to do. We decided to take a little hike for old time's sake. I was around 12 and my brother about 14, so this was roughly June 2004 or 2005. He had picked up cigarettes as a habit, so I credited his idea to head into the woods and as an excuse to smoke freely and not have to worry about our parents popping in and catching him or smelling the smoke. We headed out and hiked a pretty decent distance from home, definitely far enough to keep his nicotine habit a secret from our parents and way out of sight. We decided to stop and sit for a bit. It was mid-evening and the sun was dimmer, but left us enough time to hang out for a while and make it back home with enough time to spare before it was dark out. He set into smoking his cigarettes, and I had picked up a stick and was just whacking plants and digging in the dirt. We were having short bursts of conversation, but mostly sat there, lost in our own thoughts. After about 30 minutes of sitting there, that strange silence fell over us, and we looked at each other to gauge if the other thought we should head back like we used to as kids when it got quiet out there. My brother just shrugged and lit another cigarette, so I went back to digging in the dirt, lost in my own business. I was feeling a little uneasy, but figured I was just being a chicken because my brother seemed completely unbothered. It was so silent I could hear my brother calmly breathing across from me and could even hear the tobacco crackle when he took a draw off a cigarette. I heard a little rustling that sounded a little off in the distance and some twigs breaking. We literally grew up in the woods and were taught about all kinds of wildlife by our hunter of a father. I credited the rustling to a deer or a coyote off a ways from us and never looked up. A few minutes later, though, something caused me to look up. The calm breathing I had heard from my brother seemed to catch in his throat. I jerked my head up to see what was wrong with him. His face was pure white, and he was looking a little to my right and back behind me. Normally, I would have laughed it off because my brother loved trying to scare me and play little pranks. But the look on his face was pure horror. I turned my whole body in the direction he was looking. About 50 or so yards away was a creature. This thing was standing on two legs and stood every but of 7 foot tall. Even at the distance, it looked huge. I backed toward my brother without taking my eyes off this thing. It looked like it was covered in fur, dark brown or black. I'm not sure about the eyes since we were just far away enough not to make out the smaller details, but if the sun had hit them, I can guess they would have been yellow or gold. We kept gaze with it for what seemed like hours, even though it couldn't have been more than a minute or two. It didn't move the whole time we stared at it to this point. It was like sizing us up as we were it. After what seemed like an eternity, which was probably only 3 or 4 minutes by now, it kind of huffed at us. It wasn't a growl or a snarl. It just seemed to be testing us to see how we would react if it threatened us in some way. We stood concrete still. It then dropped on all fours and took on a single awkward step toward us, like it wasn't moving on all fours, but wanted to seem animalistic. Again, we did not move. After being told all your life not to run from predators or they will chase you, we were not risking a race with this thing. It took one more clumsy step toward us. When we didn't budge, it took off in the opposite direction. As soon as it was completely out of sight, we darted toward home. I don't think we had ever cleared the woods so quickly in our lives. We burst through the front door and locked it behind us. We just collapsed in the living room and never spoke of it again. This is my grandfather's story. Way back in the 80s and 70s, my grandfather used to work as a mechanical engineer for the Army. He was stationed and worked in a special base that he will not disclose the location of. He did say, though, that this base was around the Georgia area, but miles out in the middle of nowhere. His job was to work on several different pieces of equipment, as well as a vast array of other miscellaneous tasks. He tells me it was quite often that they would constantly be having issues with these wolf-like creatures attacking soldiers as they left and entered the base. He explained that they were fairly tall with very large muscles and human-like legs. I showed him the werewolves from the movie Dog Soldiers, and he told me that not quite, but they look definitely similar. Especially since that's the only movie where I've seen them have human-like legs, and he told me the legs were on point. He also mentioned how all of these things were that it aligned with the height of the werewolves in that movie. That's the closest he's been able to describe these things to me. He said one time, one almost got in as one soldier was leaving, and that its head was nearly blown off by a few of our snipers. These animals were nocturnal, and would use that to their advantage. He said he doesn't recall any of his fellow troops being killed, but his sergeant was attacked and left with a huge scar down his back and face. This had occurred over the course of 4 months and got to the point to where these creatures were noted as kill on sight. They would only come out at night and they would stalk and walk around the perimeter. It's almost like they were looking for a weak point to get in. As soon as they became kill on sight, they stopped coming around, and I don't remember if he said anything about seeing them after, but I don't think he did. He got transferred only 6 months after the initial sighting to another part of the country and didn't keep tabs on anybody in that base at the time. However, he tells me that some of his old buddies from other bases around the country doing similar lines of work had mentioned similar occurrences. One of his closer friends, who was also a mechanical engineer as well, is long passed away now, but this friend at the time was working out of the Southern Oregon base out there. He said that there was constant howls off in the distance at night, with wood knocks and other strange bizarre noises he could not explain. One of the patrolling soldiers had a near-death encounter with what he could only describe as a giant ape man thing a few miles outside of the base. This creature smashed the front end of his vehicle to the point to where it was no longer operable and had to flee on foot. My grandfather has other crazy tales about similar things happening, but after all that, he had never had anything else happen to him. I've owned my house now for a good 10 years and have never noticed this problem until just last spring. I have a good portion of my yard up front that I have set up for a 24 by 24 vegetable garden. Nothing extravagant, but it allows me to grow my onions, peppers, basil, and tomatoes. I've had this vegetable garden set up since I moved in and never seen such a creature in my life. It all began in the spring. I would go out in the morning and tend to my vegetables, and I couldn't help but notice the continuous feeling of a bad omen. This feeling would just start in the pit of my stomach and take over, and I could never figure out why exactly. This went on for weeks, and the feelings only intensified. I believe it was around early May when I discovered a pair of eyes staring at me from around 8 feet off the ground, not too far off into the thicket. In that very moment, I vividly remember watering my dahlias and turning to look, and there were these yellow glowing eyes. Initially, I didn't take it as fear because I had to register that it was actually eyes looking at me, and then I realized that these eyes were very high up and attached to something rather large. I panicked and dropped my watering can and ran for my house and locked my doors. I did not go out of my garden the rest of the day. I began to feel uneasy, even in my own house. I felt like I was always looking for these pair of eyes. I kept my curtains and windows closed after that. Things seemed to die down for a little while until about a couple weeks later when I stepped outside my house in the evening and noticed this big gray hairy shape off in the woods to my right. I made a beeline for my car and drove out of there. I'm sure I left smoke in the gravel. I returned the following morning without noticing anything out of place. This is where I start to notice this animal really watching me. After that, this thing started getting closer and closer. I first got a real good look when it started to charge at me when I was working on painting my fence by my vegetable garden. I heard this loud crash bang, and as I looked over, this massive gray walking wolf on 2 legs is charging right at me. I fled in fear and locked myself inside my house and kept all of my knives near me. I called the police, but they said they couldn't help me, and then I just needed to be careful of the wildlife around, like to not leave food out, don't provoke them, etc. So much for that. June did come, and I would catch this thing looking in my windows. Luckily, I never saw it directly because I kept my curtains closed, but they were thin enough for light and shadows to come through, and I would see the silhouette of a massive wolf head in my windows. It would take every ounce of me not to scream, and the experience was traumatizing in its own. As summer drew closer, there would be nights I could sense it was outside my house, pacing or just waiting. I didn't really know who I could turn to or what I could do. Things stayed about the same until about mid-July when I remember suddenly things just stopped. The feeling of evil had disappeared, and I was able to go back out to my garden peacefully. I stayed on high alert for weeks afterwards, thinking it was a trap. but I have yet to still encounter this creature. I still live in the same house as of now, and I'm writing this to you. It's January 14th, 2020. My only fear is that this thing will return come the spring, when it's time to tend my garden once again. Do you have any ideas of how I can get rid of this? Something really strange is going on here. I'm writing this to you because I believe there's a dogman in my neighborhood area. Over the past 6 months, all the pets in the neighborhood have been vanishing left and right. I am surrounded by animal lovers and know that my surrounding neighbors have many pets. I've been asked so many times in the past couple of months if I know where their animals have gone, and I've seen all the missing pet papers. I've never been in this sort of situation before, and originally chalked all of this up to be a mountain lion. Upon further research, I ended up falling down a rabbit hole which led me to the Dogman phenomenon. I had read several encounters and heard things through Vic's channel about people experiencing similar things. Their pets going missing, finding animals mutilated, etc. I can't say that's entirely what this is, but I just have a feeling. For the record, I live in Ohio, and there's a big creek that runs near us about 2 or so miles away from the general neighborhood. I don't know if that helps at all, or if that makes the Dogman more inclined to hang around here. I'm not so sure. I'm just looking for answers. I'll never forget the day my grandfather passed away. This would have been January 2009. My grandfather and I were very close, largely in part to my father passing away at a very young age due to medical complications. I don't really remember my father a whole lot, but I grew up extremely close to my granddad. At the time this happened, I was 26 and working a local security job. My grandfather lived about 2 hours away from me. Keep in mind this was in the dead of winter and there was a lot of snow and ice on the roads. I got the call early in the morning, about 5 a.m., that he never woke up. My grandfather is usually up at 3 in the morning and goes to bed at like 6 or 7 in the evening. I fly in my car out to my grandparents' house. Because they live so far out, there's certain old highways and roads I have to take to get to them, and with the snow and ice in the early morning, it becomes a very treacherous situation very fast. As painful as it was losing my grandfather that day, something else happened to me that terrified me to my core. I'm almost to my grandparents, and I'm pulling up on this long dirt road which is around 6 miles, with their house near the end. They lived in the sticks, and I'm surrounded by pine and fir all around me. I see what I can make out to be a large animal eating a dead deer in the middle of the road. I pull up slowly and this thing turns around and stands up on 2 legs. Now let me explain something. As I pulled up to it, it looks weird to begin with because it looked as if it was half man, half wolf, crouching, and I was seeing its backside. But once it turned its head at me and stood up, I slammed on my brakes. I gasped in fear. This thing did not stare at me more than 2 seconds before it crouched ever so slightly and leapt up into the air and disappeared. I couldn't stop screaming and slammed the acceleration so hard I nearly lost control of the car and crashed. I somehow managed to fly down the snowy, icy road without crashing, eventually reaching my grandparents' house only minutes later, or so it felt. There was already an officer on site at the house, and several of my other family members since they didn't live too far away. Even though I was overwhelmed by sadness and despair, I pulled the police officer aside and asked him if he saw anything driving up here, and the cop just looked at me strangely and told me no. Nothing else was said, and I comforted my grandmother, and my family stayed with us there for a few days to take care of my grandmother. Part of me wonders if what I saw that night was the evil that followed him around. My grandmother would tell me multiple times that he had this darkness surrounding him, and she never really elaborated, so I always understood that as just a figure of speech for bad luck. But maybe she meant something more. I found out a little later on that when he was much younger, He dabbled in witchcraft for a very short while. I have no idea if what I saw is related to all that, but judging by what I've researched from the encounters that I've read, I can only make an educated speculation. Around summertime, back in 2015, and me and a close bro of mine were startled beyond words when we heard a strange growl walking on the backside of his property. Told about the supposed Dogman that lives in Wisconsin, but always thought of it like a cruel joke parents told children. This was nearby some woods, so you know this happened out in Rock County in Wisconsin. It's actually fairly close to Bray Road. If you don't know anything about Bray Road, I would suggest you look that up. The Bray Road event started the entire werewolf phenomenon that people report seeing, to my knowledge. Anyway, when we heard this weird growling sound, I turned to my bro and said, "Do you hear that?" He nodded yes. We were both scared out of our wits. Neither of us have ever heard an animal like that, and we spent a lot of our time outside. This growling continued and was coming towards us. I noted for my bro to start back towards his house, and this tall canine-like figure steps out of the woods, walking our way. It looks like a large canine with pointy ears. I couldn't see any eyes or really other features besides that. It looked to be about our height and a slender build if I had to guess off memory. Its strides were humongous, and I remember only looking for a few seconds before my buddy and I sprinted back to our house and grabbed a shotgun. Well, his shotgun. All I had was a .22 on me, and I knew that wasn't going to do shit to this animal. We waited by the door for this animal to approach the house, and we knew we weren't going to fight off this animal had it broke in, but we were going to try. Not too much longer later, we heard this thing come up to the house, and what sounded like it stood entirely still. We knew it was stalking us, so we kept the house on lockdown all night long. This thing never attempted to attack us nor the house. In the morning, we went out to look for tracks and found massive canine tracks all over the property and the house. I turned to my bro and told him he needs to up his firepower game. This creature has been coming back to his property, even up until now. He's had to shoot at it several times, but it never attacks him or his house. What makes him nervous is that it's getting really close, almost like an animal that's far too curious. My mom ended up moving out to the country after my father passed away years ago. She continued to stay in the house they're living in for a while until she found a nice little small house. In the back, it had several acreage and a hill that led down to a tiny little wooded creek. I was over at her house helping her move and unload when my sister, who's around 16 at this time, comes running back to the house screaming. She kept screaming that there was a tall black shape walking around on two legs around the creek, growling in her direction. Not sure what to make of it, my mother just told her not to go back there anymore. I guess after that, this thing would follow my sister around. It would look into her window at night and stare at her, and when she would get in and out of her car. When she ended up going off to college at 18, this thing seemed to disappear. I'm more intrigued about it than she is, and I guess after a while, it still scared her, but she learned to ignore it. I never saw it with my own eyes, but she just told me in depth about it. I am a believer in the unexplained and paranormal, and I believe that something attached itself to my sister. Spent the weekend camping with my brother and family at a packed campground during the weekend. Well, I should say that this happened back in 1996, so this didn't just happen. Anyway, there was a really large man-made lake that my brother and I desperately wanted to explore. My brother and I were only 17 and 15 when this happened. My parents were pretty strict on what we could and couldn't do, even though we were almost of adult age. Luckily for my brother and I, we waited until they fell asleep, around 10 p.m. We snuck out of our tent and went around to explore. It's pretty sad when you're 17 and your parents still helicopter you and give you a hard time, but I guess they were just nervous about us, either disturbing other people or God knows what. Being summertime, there were still a lot of people up and fires going on when we decided to take a couple of the nearby trails after hanging out by the man-made lake. We talked to a few people here and there, making small talk and enjoying the night together. I think at some point we got offered booze but declined. There were quite a few really cool trails around the area, and being 17 and 15, we felt indestructible and decided it was a good time to go night hiking without any sort of light other than our tiny camping flashlights. There is this one really cool trail that extends out quite a ways and then loops back around to the other side of the campground, totaling 2 miles if I remember correctly. It's like a big horseshoe, but the big horseshoe extends into the national forest and then back around. We got on the trail around 10:45 p.m. and only saw a few other people walking their dogs. We were pretty much the only ones there, so it made for fun. I had stolen a cigarette from my father, and I was going to smoke it once we got far enough down the trail. We had been walking for probably around 20 minutes, and everything around us was dark and quiet, since we were in the forest part now. My brother started to complain that maybe we should have gone back, and that if Mom and Dad wake up to us not being there, we were going to be grounded for the rest of our lives. I told him to calm down and that we would be fine as I lit up my cigarette. My brother was just being stupid and paranoid at times, so I just ignored it. We continued walking and decided to pick up our pace a little to make good time, because I did not want to be back super late either. We got to a point in the trail where it kind of goes up this little hill that curves around and then dips back down again. My brother grabbed me and stopped me in panic, saying that somebody was out there in the woods trying to scare us. I laughed at him, thinking he was trying to pull a fast one, and yelled out to the woods, "If anybody's out there, we're so scared," and kept laughing. This was all a joke to me, and I would soon find out that it wasn't. My brother shushed me, and we both listened. He wasn't lying. I began to hear shuffling noises in several different places around us in the woods. I'm terrible at judging distance, so I couldn't tell you how far away it was, but it sounded close by. I heard a few bits of shuffling to the right of me, and to the left. My brother began panicking, thinking we were about to get jumped, or some crazy axe murderer was going to kill us. I told him to calm down and let's just keep walking. As we began to walk up this hill, the noise still continued, but it began getting closer to the trail, and closer to the spot we were when we stopped. I told him to just keep picking up his speed, and when we reached the top of the hill, he turned around, screamed, and took off sprinting. In that second, I knew something was terribly wrong, because my brother, who used to be super lazy, and for him to take off sprinting, he must have been spooked. Thinking he was just being melodramatic, I turned around and shone my small flashlight in the direction that he screamed. And down on the trail where him and I both heard the initial shuffling noises were these two huge dog-like figures standing on two legs. The first thing I noticed when I shone my light was the pointy ears and the red glow of the eyes. I couldn't tell if they emitted a red glow from the reflection of my flashlight into their eyes, or they just had an unnatural, evil glow to them. Either way, I froze. My flashlight wasn't great, so it was pretty dim shining that far away, but enough that I saw their faces. They were ugly. It reminded me if you crossed a hyena with a wolf and stuck it on a bodybuilder human body. Huge bodies. I thought these two things were demons coming to get me. They just stared at me. I dropped my flashlight and I sprinted as fast as I could, following after my brother and not saying a word. I ran for my life. I've never felt such mortal danger before. Time began to slow down dramatically, and I felt like I was running in a time warp. After what seemed like running for an hour, I made it out on the other side of the trail back to the campground. Turns out we're actually only about a mile away from the end of the trail, so we had walked a good ways before we had saw what we did. I collapsed on the ground shaking when I got to the trailhead entrance. Between the outermost fear and danger and absolute exhaustion, my body was overworked. If these demons were following me and coming to get me, there is nothing I could have done. I felt helpless and alone. Things around me started to get really quiet, and I didn't hear any of the shuffling noises I was hearing earlier. I picked myself back up and fled to my tent, where my brother was already curled in the fetal position, sobbing. I tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't even make eye contact with me, let alone acknowledge me. Neither of us got much sleep that night, if at all, and my parents never knew we even left. Again, this happened back in '96, and to this day my parents don't know what happened. I try to figure this encounter down as to demons that were coming to get us, but now that I know a little bit more about cryptids and creatures out there that exist, I wonder what's really around there. A little more insight as to the location. I can't really remember the campground because we were doing this long road trip thing with my dad for his business at the time. It was somewhere around Indiana, I believe. That encounter has stayed with me ever since, and I've never been so fearful of my life before. My mom recently began getting very sick, and so I've had to come and stay with her to be her caretaker. I've been her caretaker now for about 7 months. She's still able to get up and get around, but not a whole lot like she used to. I'm her only child, so I'm obligated to give her the support that she needs. Now, this happened just last month, in December. We live quite a ways out of town on a lone road that is surrounded by pine on both sides. You take a right down about half a mile, and her house is to the left. She has some neighbors, but they are more spread out. We are the first house on the street. There's a lot of logging around this area, and has been for some time. I know on the other side of the road beyond the pine was some new construction going on. They were clearing trees for more development. Since this was in December, it gets dark fairly early, like 4:30. This happened probably around 8 p.m. if I remember right, at night when my mother was driving home from the grocery store just to pick up a few things. I hear her park and run faster than I've ever heard her run to the door and slammed it shut. I look over and her face is pale white, and she looked like she had just seen a ghost. I asked her what was wrong, and she tells me she hit the biggest dog she's ever seen in her life. She went to tell me that she was pulling into the road, and this humongous dog ran across the road, and she collided with it. She was too scared to get out and check for damage, so she just drove right here. Confused and concerned, I ran outside with the porch lights on to check if there was any severe damage. I didn't see any immediate damage, dents, or any scratches of any kind. However, there was this long stringy hair all over the front of her Ford Escape, and in the front grille. Bizarre, but I've never seen any kind of dog like what she described. I don't even think any of our neighbors close by have any dogs that I'm aware of. She obviously hit something. I grabbed a handful of the stringy hair and brought it to her, and asked her if this belonged to what she had hit. She said yes. I can't explain this for myself, nor is there really any evidence to point that this is anything other than the ordinary, but it's still rather strange. When I asked her to give me more details on what she saw, she explained to me that it was just gray and dark in color, and about the size of a moose. I don't know if I necessarily believe her, but this is just what she relayed to me. This last winter, I was doing some hiking in and around the Appalachian mountain area. I discovered what I believed to be Dogman tracks. I even made casts of the tracks that were in the wet, cold winter mud. These were huge prints, easily the size of a lion's paw. I believe they're Dogman prints because I've been an avid outdoorsman and an avid Bigfoot researcher until only in the past couple years when I've been hearing more and more about this Dogman creature appearing all over. I became increasingly fascinated with this concept and began seeking any evidence I could find, even if it meant running into these things face to face. I have a couple of close friends who are also cryptid researchers as well, and so I sent the cast to them, wondering what their thoughts were. One of my close friends, we'll call him David for the sake of the story, began to tell me about these upright black wolves that roam around this 78-acre plot of land he goes to hunt at. It's state game land, and I don't remember exactly how he gains access to it, whether it be illegally or legally. Either way, he tells me he's seen them down there quite a bit looking through his scope. These things must really feed heavily on deer, because there's a wholesome amount of doe in that area, with the occasional buck that comes through. The numbers have dwindled in the years, but it's still a semi-decent place to hunt in the deer season. David, like I, has been a heavy-duty researcher and a fan of Bigfoot and cryptids. To my knowledge, he did not know about the Dogman cryptid until I told him about the casts that I made and sent them to him, and then proceeded to tell me what he had been seeing every fall. He stays a great distance away from these creatures, unsure of what they're capable of. I'm going to try and set up a way I can fly out to him, and he could take me to this area so I can see them for myself. Wish me luck. If you or someone you know has a story, encounter, or experience you would like to share with my viewers, please send it to my email at stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. Thank you. I was out looking for a good buck with my .30-06 in dense foliage many years ago, circa 1999 to 2002. I was scouring around the area when I spotted a large black shape stand up from behind a bush and noticed large dog ears on top of its head. That's when I noticed it had a dog head on a human body, and I panicked. This thing was only about 15 feet away from me, and it towered over me. This thing had to have easily been around 7 to 8 feet tall, if not bigger. This was in broad daylight, so I was able to see every detail pretty clearly. I'll never forget its eyes. They were black. It's almost as if they were emanating evil and absorbing all light around it. The thing stared me down for a few seconds before I slowly backed away, never taking my own eyes off of this thing. It had a rather large muzzle, and I didn't quite see any teeth. Its arms looked like they extended well beyond its waist and had what I can tell to be human hands. Extremely large chest and pulsating muscles. In fact, I could see its muscles rippling through its fur. As I'm slowly backing away, I'm trying to make sure this thing isn't going to move in on me and attack. I don't know if it was there before I got there or if it had been following me and planned to attack. It scared the living hell out of me. I don't normally hunt around Dayton, Texas. I thought I would try a few new areas during that period of time, and Dayton was one of the areas. I never knew they had critters like that in that part of Texas, and I stay out of that place now. Summertime 2006. I went camping in Arkansas, west of Eureka. I believe this is right off of Beaver Lake, since that's the only known lake in that area, to my knowledge. During that time, I was doing a lot of traveling, on foot hiking around the mountains. I hiked the entire summer by foot, and would just camp out in the middle of the woods. I traveled a lot along Arkansas into the Ozarks and down south. This event happened sometime during that journey, and I've only ever had an experience like this then. I had been hiking all day long, and it was rather hot, since I believe this happened in July. I decided to set up camp, and maybe a mile away from the bank of the lake. After setting up my tent, I did my usual explore a little bit until nightfall had arrived. I had an electronic lantern that I used to go and get water for my canteen. I would bring this canteen back and boil the water. I approached the bank of the lake, and I heard rustling off to my right. As I turned to look and see this bizarre animal staring at me, I noticed its striking yellow eyes staring right at me. And in the darkness, my eyes adjusted. I could begin to make out the head and realized it was a large dog. I started to panic because I thought it was a wolf, but noticed the body wasn't right. It was on all fours, but its lower back was hunched down. It's hard for me to explain, but it kind of had a hyena-looking body, if that makes sense, where the front arms are much longer and the back legs are shorter. I believe I must have startled this thing when I stepped out of the woods to walk up to the bank of the lake to get water. I was frozen in place at this thing. I began to notice after just a few moments, it frantically kept looking behind it and then back at me. This went on for probably another 5 to 10 seconds, if I had to guess. At that moment, I was confused and not quite sure what was happening. But then it dawned on me that this creature wasn't alone. Briskly, I turned around and quickly paced back to my tent. I was very concerned because I have never seen an animal like that and had no idea what I was dealing with. I ended up skipping dinner that night and just crashing out early, keeping my machete near me all night long. The following morning, I packed up and moved on and never experienced anything strange like that again in my time since then. This includes anything like Bigfoot or anything else that might be unexplained. I didn't really see any details because it was dark outside, other than its eyes, which seemed to have a faint glow to them. The body, I was only able to see somewhat of a silhouette, and could tell it was a dark shape sitting there. Even though I had my lantern, its light couldn't extend far enough for me to see the details of this animal. I have no idea what kind of predator I was dealing with. For all I know, it could have been an undiscovered species of wolf, or something. I should probably reiterate and say that this wolf, or so I will call it, was huge, easily double the size of a Great Dane. It was so unnatural. Pairing that with the glowing yellow eyes really just made me uneasy. I was headed southbound on Highway 321 at around 9 p.m. at night, just a little north of Chugwater, Texas. This was back in April of 2004. As I'm driving down the road, the largest German Shepherd that I've ever seen steps out onto the road on two legs. Startled, I go to slam on my brakes when this thing lifts its left arm to shield its eyes from my oncoming headlights. I come to a stop about 10 feet away from it, and it is just standing there, holding its arm over its face. I'm freaking out, not knowing what the hell I'm looking at, when this thing suddenly, slowly lowers its arm, and I see this piercing amber glow. I had my windows rolled down then, and I could have sworn I heard this animal snarl at me. I was very intimidated because this thing stood at least 9 feet tall. It was very lanky and skinny, and had shaggy long hair hanging off of its arms. I couldn't get a good look at its legs. I went into fight or flight mode and threw my car in drive and swerved around this animal with the acceleration pressed all the way down. It was a surreal experience. It's like everything slowed down in that 1 minute. I didn't bother looking in my rearview mirror to see if that thing was going to follow me. I had such a fear take over me that I felt if I didn't drive off, I would have been done for. A pretty traumatizing incident happened to me when I was around 12 years old. I had an encounter with what I would explain to be a werewolf. It wasn't until I was older that I started learning about cryptids like Bigfoot, and much later on, Dogman. I drew interest in learning about this because I felt like it would supply me with an answer to what I had experienced when I was a kid. After reading and listening to several different encounters by several different YouTubers, I came across you. This is why I'm writing to you, to tell you what happened, and so that your readers can know that these things do exist. They are out there. At the time, I was thoroughly convinced it was a real-life werewolf, but I was always in denial about it until I learned that there are these things called Dogman. When I was around 12 years old, I used to walk this long trail that was around 3 miles near my house. I was in my first year of middle school and very athletic. I loved track and loved to run. So at that age, I was really focused on building up my endurance and stamina, so I would try and walk this trail every day. I had been walking it for months prior to this incident happening. I felt like this particular afternoon was really no different than any other day. I couldn't tell you exactly where along the trail I was, because it didn't just happen in one spot. It happened all throughout much of the trail. It felt off to me just walking on the trail that day, and I wasn't quite sure why. I began to notice that things were abnormally quiet. It's very common to hear the wild around you since it goes to the forest. I would usually hear the birds and the rustling of random animals, but that day, all was dead silent. It was in May, so it should have been teeming with life, but it was dead. I don't think I was down the trail for more than 15 minutes before I started to smell wet dog and a pungent odor in combination with that smell. I did not know it at the time, but later in life, I would know to learn that other pungent odor as death. I know because my grandmother whom I was very close to, passed away when I was 18, and I was in the room with her when she died. She gave off this very distinctive odor, and if you've ever been around anyone who's died, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. That's what I smelt along with wet dog. I remember I started to feel very uncomfortable, but I decided it was probably just me wigging out and needed to push through. I don't even think it was that much later when I started to hear something paralleling me in the woods to my right. At one point, I stopped and whatever was following me stopped too. That's when my heart really began to race out of my chest, and I felt like I was in danger. I didn't know who or what was in the woods with me, but I felt like they were there to hurt me. Luckily, I knew I had endurance on my side and figured whatever it was, I could outrun it. Obviously, at the time, I thought it was a person because I hadn't seen what it was yet. I stood there for a moment, still as a statue, and thought to myself, I'm going to try and run to the end of the trail and beat this thing. I quietly took in the longest breath and began to crouch down in the sprinter's position. Soon as my knee bends down, I hear the lowest guttural growl come from only around 10 feet away in the forest. It was so loud I felt it vibrate through my bones. Whatever it was had to have been huge. That growl is so deep, I must have thought it was a demon. I took off sprinting. I don't know how, but this thing took off along with me, and stayed along with me the entire way I sprinted. I was thankful that I wasn't getting winded because I was really able to push myself out of pure adrenaline and the fact that I was in really good shape to be able to make it near the end of the trail. I was probably within half a mile, I guess, from the end of the trail when this thing jumped out on the trail behind me. As I'm running, I'm turning my head around to look who it was, and my body tensed up a little when I realized this wasn't a person. Somehow, miraculously, my legs didn't stop moving because I was in such a state of panic that this thing stopped following me. I kept looking back as I'm sprinting towards the end, and this thing is just standing there, watching me run. Either somebody was in an extremely convincing werewolf costume, or I really ran into a real-life werewolf. I replay that moment over and over in my head, but then I can't explain the growl. I don't know if it was chasing me out of its area or territory or what. Eventually, I did lose sight of it and was able to make it back home. I had been crying because I was so terrified. I never ended up telling my parents about it because I knew, of course, they wouldn't believe me, but I didn't know how to rationalize what I experienced at only 12 years old. It haunted me for quite a while after that, and I never went back to the trail. Instead, I just focused on running around the neighborhood. I did open up to my friends about it in high school, and they believed me, but when asked if they ever experienced anything like that, or even knew anybody who did, they didn't. Earlier, I said that I learned of this creature later on in life, and it was after high school when I really started researching the paranormal and creatures. At the time, I never associated what I saw in that category until I discovered Dogman and learned more about how people describe it and the way this thing behaves. I hope telling my story allows your readers to confront the reality that they're faced with every day, if they'd experienced something they don't feel like they could share with others. To go back when I was living by myself before I met my current wife, I was stepping outside one night to take out the trash and recyclables. I have a very long driveway, probably about 200 feet if I had to guess. I keep my trash at the very end and I honestly don't mind the walk. I'm heading to my trash can, trash bag in my right hand, recyclable in the other. It's dark, but it is a clear night. I believe the moon was out, but I have no idea if it was full. As I approach my trash can, I open the lid and throw the bag in. I do the same to the recyclable, and as I'm putting on the lid to the recyclable can, I hear something large moving around in the hedges about 5 feet away. I turn my head, and through a hole in the hedges, I can see these bright, glowing, red-orange eyes. As my eyes fixate on these glowing orbs, a face and snout begin to take shape along with it. My stomach dropped, and I knew I was going to die if I did not get out of there. I left my gun inside the house, so I was virtually defenseless if this thing decided to attack me. Whatever it was in my hedges, I turned around and ran back to my house and promptly locked the door. I kept my pistol close by the door just in case anything happened. That was the only time I'd ever encountered something like that. I would like to start off and say that I don't mess around. I'm an avid explorer, but I'm also an avid gun lover. I collect many different kinds of pistols, rifles, you name it. Among my collection, I have a small handful of weapons that I keep on me, especially when I go out exploring into the wilderness, just to keep safe. You never know when a bear might catch your tracks, and if she has cubs around, you're done. I don't mess around for that reason alone. I travel with a .357 Magnum on me. I'm a huge fan of the .44, but I feel like the .357 is much easier for me to aim and for accuracy's sake. Those of you who know what I'm talking about will probably agree. I feel like a .357 is more than sufficient to hold off an angry bear in case I come across one or any other potential predators I might run into. Now, let me tell you about my expeditions. I do really enjoy hiking and camping, but I also just love going out on long expeditions where I walk for 8 to 12 miles, if not more, in many different areas. I spent a lot of time up in the Pacific Northwest, traversing through Washington and Oregon, as well as the Midwest around Ohio, down into Kentucky. I love sightseeing, and I usually travel with a friend or two, for company's sake. When this happened, we were traversing through the Chattahoochee National Forest. Since I keep my Magnum on me, I felt pretty confident I can handle most treacherous situations. We ended up coming across a small creek where the woods around us fell silent. My friend and I both knew what that meant. It stayed silent for quite some time, and we weren't sure whether it was safer to stay put or to go out on the move. Not even 5 minutes we were there when this happened, when we began to move on and we heard multiple sounds all around us. There was shuffling and rustling of the ground and leaves. We heard deep breaths and huffs. These noises were coming beyond our visibility. The brush was so thick we couldn't exactly see what was making these noises, but due to the surrounding sounds, we knew there was more than one of this animal. It was getting dusk out, but there was still light and visibility. These noises began to encroach and get closer. I pulled out my Magnum and shot it 3 times in the air. My hand still in the air, the woods go from quiet to a frenzy. I began hearing all sorts of crazy howls, growls, scratching, weird noises, and other stuff. It sounded like 100 coyotes having a WWE match all around us, just beyond our vision. It was so loud, I felt threatened, and I wasn't going to take a chance. I fired several shots randomly into the woods, and things got silent again. I have no idea if I hit anything or anyone. What I did, and nobody should ever do because you don't know if there's people or humans around, and I know it might not sound believable, but I was acting purely on fear in that moment. I knew there weren't people around us, and I knew there was something more sinister going on. My friend and I waited for a moment, and things stayed silent, and we just took off as fast as we could. We were still about 7 or so miles away to where we originally parked and entered, so we had a long trek back. That's the only time I've ever felt threatened like that in the woods. I've had to ward off a bear before, but it was never anything close to the amount of fear that I felt in that moment. I've read many Sasquatch encounters and heard similar things happen, so I don't know if that's what I encountered, but I didn't think that Sasquatches were real, and I didn't think that Sasquatches would growl and howl and make all those sort of weird noises like what I heard. I'm not really sure what surrounded us, but there were multiple of them. We can hear it. Whatever it was had to have been big because of the deep huffs of breath. I never would have guessed in a million years something like that would have happened deep in the wilderness of Georgia. This was just last fall when I was driving around with my stepfather. I just got him picked up to bring him back to my wife and I's house. He and my mother-in-law lived in a small trailer park out in the boonies, a way out. Lots of farm and agricultural areas. The trailer park is off of a long gravel 1-lane road. This was in at night, so it was dark outside. I'm pulling away from the trailer park area, stepfather in my passenger seat. This hyena-looking animal, walking on 2 feet, walks across the road about 100 feet up ahead. Both I and my father-in-law start freaking out, asking the other if what we both saw was real, and if we really did both see it. My stepdad kept trying to get me to turn around once we passed where it crossed, wanting to see where it went and what it was. I told him I wasn't going to touch that animal with a 100-foot pole, and wanted nothing to do with it. It was ahead of us, so I couldn't see it vividly, but it looked ugly from what I saw. Black and very hyena-ish. That's the best way I can accurately describe it. 30 years ago, I had to drive up north to Grand Rapids, Michigan for an important business meeting. I was an investor in a small tech company and was going to meet with other investors and the owners, so I needed to drive up to Florida to Grand Rapids. When I entered into Michigan State, I needed to stop and get gas, fill up on food, and the works. I pulled off a bit as this small burger joint that's kind of on the edge of town. I couldn't tell you what town it was, but it couldn't have been too far off the highway from entering into Michigan. I pull up to this tiny burger joint to get a bite to eat, and I go in. It's a tiny restaurant, and I notice I'm the only customer that's there. I go up to the counter, and the manager is there. He turns to me and tells me they're closing down early. He introduces himself and tells me he's sorry for the inconvenience. He expresses to me I need to be careful driving around here at night. I figured he meant because of gangs or something along those lines. As I'm walking out of the restaurant, he stops me and offers to kindly walk me out to my car. I thought this behavior was very strange, but he seemed very concerned for my safety. Let me just add that I don't think this restaurant is here to this day because I can't remember the name of it, but it was one of those restaurants that it's a one-of-a-kind thing. Geographically, beyond the parking lot had wilderness surrounding all of it, except the highway. We stepped outside. He stopped me and offered me a cigarette. He looked me sincerely in the eyes and asked me if I had a moment, and I told him yes. He pulled out a cigarette for himself and lit it and took a drag. He asked me if I was from around here, and I told him no, and that I was on a business trip up here from Florida. He chuckled and proceeded to tell me I need to listen, because what he was going to tell me, I probably would not believe. This really piqued my interest, so I gave him my attention. I told him I was all ears. He then told me things that will haunt me and stay with me forever. It was enough to make me tell my fellow investors at the meeting the next day that I will no longer be returning to Michigan and that I will have to withdraw my investment in the company. I remember this guy's name was Roger. I don't remember his last name, but I guess that's not important. He explained to me that he has been working at this restaurant for around 11 years now. As long as he's been working there, they've been really struggling as a business due to an outside problem, he called it. Much of their business continuously gets driven away by these upright, walking canine creatures that keep attacking customers and their vehicles. They hide in the woods and wait and watch for cars to go in and out, and they'll jump out at people leaving or going in. They've chased after cars, but nobody has been killed or seriously injured to his knowledge. Shortly after he took the job 11 years ago, the original owner of the restaurant had retired from being the owner about 6 years prior to his employment. He went missing one night and was last seen in our restaurant, and nobody knows what happened to him. There is never any evidence found, even though there was a full police investigation, which is funny because the police have been called and multiple reports have been made about what's going on at this location, and we've been scoffed at and ignored. It took for somebody to go missing for them to actually take them seriously, but nothing turned up. The investigation eventually ended and things resumed. If it wasn't for the continuous amount of business loans that the second owner had been taking out, we would have been shut down a long time ago. We have had a much easier time functioning during the day, but sightings and attacks will still happen. Obviously, money is hemorrhaging. I can hardly believe what he is telling me, but he had such sincerity, fear, and concern in his voice and face that I was left with no choice. Either he was the world's greatest actor, or I needed to get the hell out of Dodge, and now. These things can range from gray to black and are very territorial and violent. They're all over the state, and if I'm going up to Grand Rapids, I need to be careful and watch every inch of my surroundings. As he finished up his cigarette, he grabbed my shoulder and wished me luck. I was terrified but surprised that as I exited, I didn't encounter anything or sense anything, as he explained to me. He wasn't shitting me either, because as I got older, I learned of a creature called the Dogman that does terrorize the state of Michigan and matches exactly what the descriptions he gave me. This was around 30 years ago. I want to say 92. There wasn't a lot of talk about Dogman, so I had no idea what he was telling me then was actually true. I had heard about Bigfoot, but that's because Bigfoot was so popularized, but I had never heard of an upright canine. The concept was just absurd at the time. I drove about another 4 hours up north until I got to a motel. I got up early, went to my investor meeting, and let them know I'm out and got the hell out of the state of Michigan, and I stay out of that state. I will never return, even though I didn't see anything that Roger told me, but it shook me, and I sincerely believed what he went through is real. My uncle owns property just outside of Lubbock, Texas, and I've gone hunting up there several times. My uncle calls me up and tells me I need to come out here and that all the doe are being killed off all of a sudden. Confused, I asked him if it could have been coyotes or a cougar. He just told me I need to come out here and see this for myself, that nothing kills like this. This confused me even more, so I went out to his property, brought some of my own equipment like my binoculars and my rifle. My uncle only lives about an hour away from me, so it wasn't a long trip. I guess he used to have a bunch of deer that would traverse through his 12 acres of property and eat on the salt blocks that he would leave out. Yesterday morning, he got up and noticed that there were nowhere to be found, which is very unusual since there's always doe walking around. There's usually at least 40, if not more, visible on site. Earlier this morning, he trekked through the woods a little ways and found many doe torn to shreds and mutilated. He was telling me he saw at least 15 plus fawns to doe ripped and shredded to pieces. Unless there's a herd of cougar that had just moved in the area all of a sudden, nothing kills that many doe. He told me that there was still a lot of meat on all these animals, but it didn't look like they were killed and eaten on, just killed and then ripped up. I had to see this for myself. I got all geared up and traversed a little bit out on his property. I could smell the blood and the death. After the initial clearing, there were several dead doe just in my line of sight. Well, they were more like piles of gore, fur, and skin than an actual corpse of a deer. The smell was coming downwind, so my nostrils were assaulted by this putrefaction. I probably spent around 30 or so minutes scouting the property, seeing the copious amounts of piles of gore all throughout. The only thing I was able to track was a multitude of large canine-like tracks. These tracks were much larger than typical canine tracks. These were easily double the size of a wolf's track. There was long hair found throughout on the ground in large, stringy clumps. I wasn't sure what to make of all of this. I've never seen this happen in my life. What was great about my uncle's property is because of all the doe in the area, it would bring in the big bucks come hunting season, and we always were able to get a buck because of it. Bucks can get stupid, just like us guys can chasing tail, and sometimes they'll make themselves even more vulnerable to chase these doe, leaving themselves out in the open. But that's besides the point. During my investigation, I didn't see any antlers or any evidence that would point to any dead bucks. This was in June, so I don't think there were any bucks in the area at the time. I only saw fawns and doe. I brought some of the hair back to my uncle, who thought it was strange, but nothing came of it. The doe started coming back to the area months later. He and I think it was a herd of something that came through the area and tore these animals up. Maybe a group of wolves, but we're not sure. If you or someone you know has a story, encounter, or experience you would like to share with my viewers, please send it to my email at stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. Thank you. This encounter goes back to 1999 when I was out in the western section of Johnston County, Oklahoma. This occurred just a little ways east of Highway 177. It was also winter outside, and I was out bobcat hunting at the time. I was more of a casual hunter then. I just enjoyed being out there in the country, seeing everything there was to see. It wasn't too much time later until I entered into this thickly wooded pasture. This pasture was very, very full of brush. At the time, I was much more of a novice hunter and thought it would lead me to a catch. After walking a ways, I remember getting a very strange sensation. I decided to explore a little more, and the feeling kept getting stronger and stronger. By this point, there were several pathways in the thick brush that looked like they were made from a very large animal. There were several of these paths forking at multiple random different points. So, I randomly followed a couple of them to the very end. The very last one led me to what I can only describe as an animal den. It was a fairly small clearing in the thick brush, no more than 20 to 30 meters around, and all around me was hair, dried blood, and bones. So many bones. I'll never forget it. I'll never forget the smell either. Animal urine, wet dog, rotting meat, and blood. It was an absolute mess of a smell. It is forever burned into my nostrils. I stood there for a moment intaking my surroundings and felt that uncomfortable feeling get really strong again. I got out of there pretty quick and decided to call it quits for the day. I know out here we got lots of critters, but I ain't ever seen no animal den like that one. Something in my gut just told me it wasn't right. I'm 29 and currently am renting a really old piece of property. See, I moved out here from the city because the rent in town is so dang expensive. I wasn't having it. Plus, I really wanted land and peace and quiet. After looking for a while, I found this house that I'm currently renting. It's basically an old farmhouse from the early 1900s that's been renovated and added onto over the course of time. It's a cozy little place. What's even better is all the cool stuff I have lying around my property from years and years ago. Hell, I even have a piece of an old Model T frame out in the acreage that was used as target practice many years ago. Whatever I've been experiencing all has to do with an old homestead that was built on this piece of property a very long time ago. It's practically falling apart due to not being kept up on, but was used for ranch hands to stay in. Judging by the wear and tear of the building, I would say at least 60 plus years. This building is probably about 100 yards from my house, and somehow, this building still has a couple of running shop outlets, and so I keep my big meat freezer in one of them. The door may be old, but it's heavily locked with a huge fat padlock, and the handle also has a padlock. I want to deter anyone from getting in there, as well as any potential threatening animals. I keep pounds and pounds of good meat in this freezer. Deer, pig, chicken, beef, lamb, you name it. I usually stock up for months and just keep all my meat in it. Here's another important piece of information. We don't got nothing out here that big. Deer and cougar are about the biggest animals out here in these woods. We have no bears or wolves anywhere. I'm kind of tucked away in the mountains a little bit, around 1,500 foot elevation, so I don't have to deal with many nuisances, except maybe coyotes. So what happened to me is, after getting up one morning and doing what I normally do, which is make coffee, etc., I noticed the homestead door was wide open. I thought it was bizarre since it had been days since I was in there, and I always keep it double locked. I thought something had happened, so I run over there, and the first thing I notice is my freezer on its side. what looks to be like it was picked up and thrown across the room on its side. The meat I had was partially devoured on the ground, with tons of meat missing. What the fuck? I thought. I inspected further but could not find any tracks, hair, smell, or evidence of any animal or person breaking into this thing. I noticed something else that was really weird. Both my big heavy-duty padlocks were gone. Not cut, not torn off, just gone. I searched and couldn't find them anywhere around the door or the homestead. Since it was cold outside and the meat was still partially frozen, I did my best to try and pick up my chest freezer and put what I had left back in. What disturbs me is this chest freezer is huge, and it's a heavy SOB. It's incredibly bulky and hard for me to move as just one person. I don't know what animal could have not only picked it up off the ground, but threw it across this huge room. And the partially devoured meat too. This meat was frozen and something came and ate it. These were huge chunks taken out of this meat, so I'm truly baffled still as to what might have happened. Like I said, we have 0 bears around here. That was the only time I've ever had a strange experience here, but since then I stopped keeping meat in that homestead and moved my meat freezer into my shop. Since then, I have not had any real problems. Not mine, but my brother's encounter. Before I tell you more, let me just say that my brother is a total bamf. He's trained in MMA, has served in the military for years. He even did 2 tours to Iraq, etc. He's a tough man, and when someone like him tells me this story and expresses how scared he was, it scared me shitless. My bro didn't even know these kinds of things existed until I told him about it. And he told me he actually had an encounter with one of these things I described him. This happened around 2010 or 2011. He had gone to visit a couple of his army buddies in Kentucky somewhere. I assume it was pretty rural. They got together, drank a bunch of good beer, had a good cookout, and then decided to end the evening and rode their ATVs around his friend's property. He was riding along with his 3 other buddies and had reached the end of the property line by this large creek that runs throughout his friend's land. He said he began to hear weird crunching noises in the leaves and began to feel like he was being watched. His buddies quickly pulled up, and they all got the same sensation. Since these are all military dudes, they were already ready for something or anything to go down, and it felt, and they thought, like somebody was sneaking around. My brother explains to me that not even 20 feet away, from behind a tree, out steps what he can only describe as a werewolf in the living flesh. He said it looked like it straight up stepped off the movie screen and was now standing in front of them, staring intently at my brother, who happened to be the closest to this thing. My brother's gut instantly knotted up. For what my brother tells me, it felt like an eternity in this locked stare down between him and this creature when his friends screamed at him to go, and they haul ass away on their ATVs, praying this thing didn't follow them or chase. He said he never looked back once to see if this animal had been following them. Since his friend's property was rather large, it took them a little bit to get back to his house, where my brother was so panicked it took a while for his friends to calm him down. All 4 of them saw it, but my brother feels like it affected him differently. He said this thing did something to him. It marked him, as he calls it. It never once took its eyes off of him to look at his other 3 buddies. He said it was hard to describe what this thing looked like exactly, just that it looked like a real-life werewolf. Said it had huge pointed teeth, was about his height, with brown blackish thick fur, stood up on 2 legs and was tapered at the waist. He got really shooken up about it when he told me it, and just telling his story gives me the massive chills. Let me just start out by saying I am an experienced outdoorsman. I have been a lover of the outdoors since I was just a wee lad. In fact, I even ended up purchasing property when I got a little bit older, just so I can go turkey hunting on it and not worry about competition or other people around me. Luckily for me, the property in which I purchased was usually full of turkeys come around springtime. For those that aren't familiar with turkey hunting season, it happens in the spring. This property that I purchased is about 56 acres of land. The geography isn't too complex. It's flat for quite some while, but then slopes down slowly with lots of thick locust trees, very rocky with occasional brush here and there. I've been using this spot for years to call in and to snag myself a good Thanksgiving tom. I've been successful just about every year. I can count on my one hand the times that I haven't gotten anything. Unfortunately, in the past couple of years, I've had to abandon this property and spot altogether due to a problem that was beginning to get out of hand. This is why I'm writing to you. It started about 4 years ago when I showed up in late May one day. It was early morning and a beautiful day. I was confident I would snag myself a good-sized tom. When I pulled into the property, I'm surrounded by large open pastures on all sides, and beyond that is thick wilderness with the slope that I talked about earlier. I usually start by calling them in and waiting by my truck before I can get a good shot. I called them in and waited. I thought it was odd that this time I wasn't hearing any noises or seeing any movement through my binoculars. This was rather unusual, so I decided to get a little bit closer. I tried calling them in again, closer to the woodline, and again, silence. There was nothing. It was eerily quiet. Something was off, and I couldn't quite tell what it was. I decided to venture a bit further to see if I could hear anything. Not even 300 yards into the woodline, I began feeling this tremendous amount of anxiety and stress. I don't know how else to put it. It was like pins and needles. I threw my binoculars up and looked around to see if maybe I can spot a turkey or something around. And as I'm moving my binoculars in full rotation, at about 10 o'clock, I met with a pair of amber eyes staring right in my direction. Since I'm looking through my binoculars, I can't really discern how big these eyes are or what animal they belong to, but it freaked me out. I pulled my binoculars down, about a few hundred yards away down the slope. This massive dark shape, with what I can only make out to be pointed ears at the top, was staring right in my direction. I watched it intently for a few moments as it stood perfectly still, facing me. I began to slowly back away, not knowing really what kind of animal I was dealing with firsthand. In a few moments, I had to back my way all the way to the woodline. This thing was now out of sight since it had never moved, but still kept looking in my direction. I quickly walked back to my truck, and as I'm about halfway to the truck, I hear branches breaking and brush moving rapidly. Something big was coming out of the woods toward me. Whatever it was sounded like it was very heavy and weighed hundreds of pounds. I picked up my pace back toward my truck, and by the time I reached my truck, it was only maybe 2 minutes later at most. I quickly turned around and put my binoculars up to see if I could spot anything. This is the only time I've ever soiled myself. Coming out of the woodline, headed in my direction, was this massive thing of an animal. I don't know what to call it because I've never seen anything like it. It had large pointed ears and a head that reminded me somewhat of a German shepherd. It was hundreds of yards away, but in my binoculars, I could see the finer details. It had huge canines, glowing amber eyes. This thing was solid black and you could clearly see the muscles rippling underneath the fur. This was probably the most muscular animal I have ever seen in my life, and looks like a flat-out killing machine. I took in more details of the face than any other part of the body, and I could see that it was clearly walking on 2 legs toward me, quickly. It had legs just like a dog, and a thinner waist. I only got a good look at this thing for only a few seconds before it was really picking up speed towards my truck and me. I have never been so scared in my life. I flew in my truck and drove out of there. Ended up not going back to the spot for the rest of the season, but I did return the following year. The following year, I came about earlier May or so. I got out of my truck and again, like last year, noticed really no turkey activity at all. I figured that unlike last year, I would just walk close to the woodline and see if I can maybe call them out. I was still fearful of the year prior and have not forgotten, but I was not going to let that stop me from doing what I love. As I'm approaching the woodline, every step I feel more and more dread. The exact same pins and needles feeling that I got the year before in the woods. By the time I finally approached the woodline, I just told myself screw it. I did not want to risk running into that animal that I did the year before. I left and just ended up turkey hunting with another friend in the area. I haven't gone back to that property out of fear that this animal might be lurking and waiting for somebody to return. Maybe this predator is the reason there hasn't been any turkeys in the area. I don't really tell this story to anybody, but I thought your listeners might enjoy it. I'm not claiming to have seen this so-called Dogman, but I definitely saw something that I cannot explain. All I know is I have never seen or heard anything like it, and it scared me to the point of releasing my inner self into my pants, so to speak. If you're somebody who's tough and enjoys the outdoors, I thoroughly encourage you to not speak of this animal and to not seek it out or try to hunt it or go looking for it. I will never be able to accurately describe the feeling that came over me when I saw this thing coming out of the woodline directly at me and my truck. I don't wish that upon anybody. Maybe at some point I'll return and this thing will be gone for good, and my turkeys, my precious turkeys, will finally be back. So, this is actually my father's encounter, back when he used to be a police officer in the late 1980s. He claims that he encountered some kind of monster, and that this thing attacked his cop car while responding to an emergency call. Where he was at, he had to drive through a more rural part of town to get where he was going. And he said that out of the side of the road, this thing leapt out at his car and slashed the shit out of the side of the car and hit his car so hard that he almost spun off into a ditch where this thing supposedly came from. He said somehow, miraculously, he regained control of the vehicle and hauled ass even faster. He says he has no idea what it was and that he only caught a quick glimpse of it. He said it was very large, dark colored with massive amounts of teeth that shined in his headlights. It came up and out of the ditch and ran right towards his car, hitting it right behind the driver's side, knocking his car almost off the road. He said he thinks it was following him for a little while he was doing at least 80 to 90 miles an hour on this lone road, trying to escape and outrun it. He ended up making it to the call, obviously. With his job, he could not report it to his supervisor. He did not want to risk his employment or any sort of ridicule from his boss or coworkers. He's kept that encounter for a very long time. I've tried to ask my father more about what he saw and asked him if he believes it could have been a werewolf or even a dogman. See, my father is a man of science and doesn't really give in to the idea of paranormal, werewolves, creatures, or any of that sort of thing. Even though it may have looked like one of those things, he just says that it was some sort of monster he couldn't describe. He never dealt with anything like that ever again, nor did anyone on the force that he knew of. This is kind of a different encounter. By different, I mean it had a very positive effect on my life in a very weird sense. Let me explain. At the time this happened, I was 19 years old. I was going through a very tumultuous time in my life. My mother had just been murdered 6 months prior, and as the case evolved more and more evidence appeared, it turned out that my own father was the murderer. They had a pretty rocky relationship for most of my early years as a child before finally splitting in a nasty divorce at the age of 11. My father was always very angry and spiteful against my mother and would do anything to make her life a living hell. As far as I know, there was minimal amount of contact between them, and I never really saw my father much after the divorce. On top of that, I was drinking heavily and dealing with a lot of depression issues and wanted to kill myself. And that's just what I set out to do, to end it all. I remember it clear as day. It was a Saturday night in August, and I had planned to go walk down to the train tracks where there is a dike running alongside of it, and lay my head down on the tracks to let the train come and take care of me. That was my plan anyway. It was around midnight when I walked down to the tracks. It was fairly quiet with minimal people around. There was a slight breeze and everything was fairly dead. As I approached a segment of train tracks that didn't really have any traffic or people around anywhere I could see, I started to approach the tracks from the dike when I heard a low growl behind me from the trees. Immediately I felt panic rise up my spine. I turned around and standing there is the werewolf from the Van Helsing movie. Not exactly, but it looked really close to that thing. I was so startled and scared, I started screaming, and this thing cocked its head back and looked at me like a confused dog would do. I'm still screaming, and as this thing looks at me for a quick moment, it then disappears off into the night. As soon as it bolts, I run as fast as I could back to where I was staying at the time. I just sat in my bedroom and cried the rest of the night, trying to process my life, my desire for suicide, and what I just saw. It really messed me up even more, but then I realized after some time that maybe it was meant to happen to me, because had that creature not popped out from the trees, I would have ended my life. Weeks after that encounter happened, I was so bogged up in trying to explain to myself what I saw that I kind of put my dark feelings aside, and it almost made me forget about my life. I tried to look into it, and what it is I saw something pointing to Bigfoot, but I knew that werewolves and those kind of things didn't exist. But I later ended up learning that it was indeed a Dogman. I look back at the whole thing now, and I really believe it was meant to happen to stop me from killing myself. I doubt you get many encounters that are like the one I had, but know to those that hear or read this that sometimes things happen for a reason, and maybe there's a reason we've all had experiences with this particular being. Close friend of mine at the time lost her dog while out and about near Lake o' the Pines in Louisiana. This thing is a huge reservoir on a bayou and is very beautiful, but somehow this friend of mine lost her dog, like I said. This dog was very important to her, and she had lost him days prior and wanted my help to see if I can't help find him. For those that are not familiar with the Lake o' Pines, there's a lot of thick brush and woods around the area, since this was June. We had gone out exploring in the evening in the area that she believes where her dog had ran off. She told me before we went that she had been exploring other parts of the park to look for him, but to no avail. We went in with flashlights and headlamps since it was getting darker, and we looked for what only seemed like hours. You have to understand, this dog was everything to my friend. I've known her for a long time, and I remember when she got this dog as a puppy. She was never married or really had much family, so this dog was kind of all she had. So, as her friend, I felt morally obligated to help her find this poor dog. It was dark when we found her dog's collar that looked like it had been chewed off. She was starting to panic, thinking that something has seriously happened to her dog, when I tried to encourage her that maybe her dog isn't far, and we should just keep looking a little while longer. That is, until we ran into the Lugaroo. I always thought it was just a legend until that night. I know this might be a very cliche thing to say, but it's honest to God's truth. We were in the thick at this point, but we came to a small little clearing where you could get into the water. It was so dark out though that you could not see without flashlights. At some point, we heard something big splashing around very close to us, so we turned and shined our lights towards the water. I gasped, and my friend starts to scream. "What is that thing?" I don't know what terrifies me more thinking back to it. Its eyes, or the fact that it had dried blood all over its muzzle and chest. This thing immediately lowered its head and let out the most evil, menacing growl I have ever heard in my life. This thing looked like it came from the pits of hell. It had a very demonic-looking face that looked like a dog standing up on two legs. It was very lanky and shaggy, but it had razor-sharp teeth and huge black claws. If I had to estimate, it was roughly 7 feet tall. We were about 30 or so feet away from it, and it was standing knee-deep in the water. I don't know why it was there, or if it was planning on sneaking up on us, or if it was stalking us, or what. Whatever the reason, it did not like the fact that we discovered its presence. I don't think we shined the light on it for more than 2 seconds before I grabbed her and we ran and we ran. We jumped in her car and we drove away, and we never spoke of it really after that. We were both so shooken up that I don't even think we were in a state to even talk. When we got back to her house, we just sat there in the car together in silence for probably close to 30 minutes before she finally said that she doesn't ever think we'll find her dog. I think the Lugaroo got to it, but I'll never know for sure. I still have nightmares about that night to this day, and no, she never ended up finding her dog. I saw this strange animal back in June of 2012. Was helping my brother move out of his place just outside of Grand Rapids, Michigan. We were making several trips to and from his new place, dropping stuff off and going back for more loads, and we were on the final trip to his new place. We had been moving all day, and it was roughly 11 p.m. at night. And the moving truck with me was just me and my brother, who was next to me. Where he lived was a longer, desolate road, and as we're going down this road, this animal climbs out from the brush on the side of the road onto the road, looks over at us, and clears the whole road in just a single bound. This thing looked like a shaggy, huge German shepherd with a wolf-like head. I don't remember the eyes at all, but it did bare its teeth at us. We pulled up on the road far enough that we had time to slow down to observe what it was. I just remember seeing so many sharp teeth in its mouth. It's like it had too many teeth. My brother and I were scared shitless, even long after it jumped off the road. Of course, he was only another 15 or so minutes down the road to where his new place was, so he was already second-guessing his decision on moving out here. He's still there to this day and hasn't mentioned seeing anything like what we saw that night again. We don't really talk about it though, to be honest. To this day, I don't have an explanation, but I'm glad I wasn't alone in the experience, or I'd think I was just totally insane. I was camping in northern Ontario along the banks of a beautiful lake. There was a dock that spanned about 20 feet over the water surface, and the perimeter was full of brush and forest. My best friend and I were the only two humans present, stargazing and talking about everything and nothing. What happened next is burned into my memory, but in the midst of our conversation, there was a deafening crack. We both turned our attention behind us and out stepped the most realistic-looking werewolf I've ever seen in my life. This thing had to have been easily 9 feet tall, hulking muscles, and a giant head. I immediately thought of the werewolf from the Van Helsing movie and damn near soiled my pants. This thing looked at me first, and I for a moment, and then stepped off into the woods as if nothing had happened. This animal had the most piercing yellow eyes I have ever seen out in nature. My friend and I were not only fear-stricken, but were stiffened by the shock of what we had just experienced. Slowly, I turned to my best friend as if to silently confirm that she had just seen the same thing that I did. The look on her face said it all. We both quietly retreated into our tent without speaking about what we saw until daylight the following day. I don't know if what we witnessed was some kind of animal or what, or if it was a different kind of otherworldly creature. Me and my cousin avoided a terrible accident 5 years ago when a large, unknown animal ran across the road and almost caused us to wipe out. I was riding on the back of my cousin's motorcycle with him down the highway. It was nighttime, and there wasn't much traffic out on the road. We came to a part of the highway where it goes up a hill and then starts to descend slowly. You can't see over this hill since it's quite long. Once we got to the top and started our descent, this huge gray animal bolts out of the woods to our right and sprints so fast across the road in just a few strides. My cousin started to turn the motorcycle, but this thing was already gone. Had this animal come out just a second later, we would have collided. It happened so very fast, but I caught a glimpse of it with the headlight hitting this thing. It looked like a giant gray wolf from what I saw, except its back was haunched all weird. I could only really make out the head somewhat because it just flew by us so fast. My cousin and I don't really talk about it because we kind of just brushed it off and continued on with our trip. I remember for the night though, my cousin was psyched about what we saw, telling me he didn't think dogs got that big out in the wild. This was almost 2 years ago, when I was 16 and didn't think much of it. But I was reminded of it today, and it gave me the chills. At the time, I lived with my dad 25 minutes out of town up on a higher mountain road, surrounded by lots and lots of woods, and a few neighbors scattered throughout. I went to sleep one night normally, only to wake up, but I woke up in a terrified state. My skin was covered in sweat and clammy, and I felt more on edge than I've ever felt before. I turned my head around to look out the window, since I do sleep next to a window, and see an all-black but very well-defined upright dog walking towards my front door, and I get this crushing feeling that it's going to attack me. This thing was pitch black and just a giant shape. I remember jumping out of my bed and running to my room door, which was open, and getting to the front door to make sure it was locked. I quickly scrambled to make sure all my curtains and windows were tightly locked. I waited quietly, but didn't hear anything. That was the first time that happened to me, and I had never experienced anything like that prior to this first event. Another experience I had is a two-parter somewhat. One night, I remember seeing red eyes staring back at me through my front window. These eyes were a good distance apart, high up in the air, heck, I'd even say 7 feet or more, and tucked away in the blackness beyond the light of my porch light. I screamed and ran to close my curtains and hide in my room for the rest of the night. Few nights later, I get another sensation again that wakes me up, like there's an evil presence outside my bedroom window. At this point, the curtains are closed entirely, and the window is for sure locked. I feel a paralyzing sense of dread and fear. After what felt like forever, I began to hear a scratching against the window. It sounded like a dog trying to claw on the glass. You know how when dogs paw on the glass repeatedly? It was like that. I honestly thought I was having vivid hallucinations until I realized what I was experiencing was real. At some point, I remember my room lighting up because something huge was standing in my window, blocking in all light from the moon. I didn't realize how dark my room had gotten, and once this figure moved from outside my window, the moonlight shone through better. These types of experiences has never happened to me again, and I'm really curious as to why I had them happen, around the same time, of course. I would say I had these in the span of maybe a month or two. I don't believe in monsters or anything like that, but whether it be a demon or something unexplained like an animal, I'll never be quite sure. My uncle had his encounter in the summer several years back. Only reason I believe him is because his whole life, he's always been a very super serious, no bullshit kind of guy. When he told the story, he sounded genuinely upset about it. He is a long-haul truck driver and was stopped on the side of a highway in a heavily wooded area. This was somewhere several miles in the middle of nowhere, but he said it was closest to Reed City. I can't recall what he said he was doing, but he had to fix something before he could just take off. Also, he didn't have a trailer on at the time. He had just gotten done fixing up his stuff and was about to climb into his truck when he saw a deer come towards him from the tree line. He said it looked like it might have been running from something. He assumed it might have been a bear. He was just getting ready to leave when he suddenly sees something looking at him through the passenger side window. He described it as having jet black fur and bright yellow eyes, as well as vicious-looking, snarling teeth. It was so close to him that he could see its fur blowing with the slight breeze that was coming through. The window was open, but it didn't seem to notice, as was evident when the creature put its paw up to the window, as if to press it against the window, but pulled it back in shock when it realized its paw actually entered the vehicle. My uncle typically carries a gun on him, and at this time, he had a heavy revolver. The exact name and caliber is beyond my memory. He pointed it at the Dogman and pulled the trigger, effectively shooting it directly in the face. Finally, the truck started moving fast enough for him to be confident that the thing wasn't following him, should it have survived the shot. He didn't bother waiting around to find out. He said he still gets disturbed when he thinks back to that event. He described it as giving off this aura of pure evil and ill intent, in only the few seconds that he faced it. He has nightmares about this creature to this day, and he has refused to tell anyone about it until several years after it happened, for fear of people thinking he had lost his mind. Another reason I'm able to buy his story is because he has never been interested in the occult, supernatural, paranormal cryptids, etc. He had no idea what to make of this thing, but when he told me the story, I told him to look into the whole Dogman phenomenon. When he looked online, he said the artist's depictions of the Dogman perfectly for what he saw that day. My roommate, a guy we'll call Jim, spent his high school years in a little town in eastern Wyoming. I can't recall the name of the town, but it was the kind of place that most people had forgotten about, since the trains had stopped coming through. It was a very weird little town, and most of the people living there seemed to be very paranoid. A lot of parents would not let their children play outside after dark, and all unfamiliar faces were regarded with suspicion. Since the town was miles away from the nearest McDonald's or movie theater or shopping mall, there was nothing for young people to do but get shit-faced drunk. That's what Jim and his friends were planning to do on the night that this encounter takes place. A fellow classmate was having a kegger at his parents' house that night, which was 20 miles out of town on a dirt road somewhere. Jim had reservations about driving out there in the dark, because that general area was known to be sort of creepy at night. But his friends really wanted to go, and he was the only one with a car. So, after some coaxing, Jim and about 5 of his friends pile into his Buick and head out of town. About an hour and a half later, they realize that they are completely lost. They can't find the road that they are supposed to turn on, and it's too dark to read any of the signs. They haven't seen any houses or cars for a while, so they figure they must have taken a wrong turn somewhere and decide to head back to the main road. After turning the car around and driving in the opposite direction for a few miles, Jim spots something in the middle of the road up ahead. His friend in the passenger seat notices it at the same exact time he does and said, "What the hell is that, dude?" At first, they can't tell what they're looking at, but as the car draws near to the big black shape in the middle of the road, it starts to look like a mass of fur. Jim thinks it must be an animal, but it looks big enough to do damage to his car, so he slows down and stops the car about 20 feet away from the thing. At this point, it is completely illuminated by his headlights, but neither he nor his passengers can figure out what the hell kind of animal it might be. Since it hasn't moved, they assume it must be dead and start to argue over who will drag it over to the side of the road. That's when the thing starts to move. They all fall silent and watch as it stirs and then suddenly stands up. Jim would always preface the next part of the story with, "I know this sounds crazy, but..." He says he can't really describe what he saw because he had never seen anything like it before. The closest he can come is this. The thing, whatever it was about 7 feet tall when it rose to its full height. Its body was shaped like a human male, but but it was covered with a thick, dark fur. The head, he said, and I watched the goosebumps break out on his arms as he said it was not human. It looked almost like a jackal or a German shepherd with a long snout and pointed ears, and its eyes were glowing in the headlights the way a cat's does sometimes. It was staring right at them. Jim doesn't know how long he stared back at the thing before he noticed that it was clutching a dead rabbit in one of its enormous hands. He had barely any time to register this bit of information when the creature suddenly flung the dead rabbit away and took a step towards the teenagers in the car. Everybody screamed and Jim slammed the car into reverse, made a U-turn, and got the hell out of there. Needless to say, they didn't make it to the party that night. This was right about a year ago. A few details out of the way first. I was living on 44 acres of mountain land. There are several buildings on the property, but the main two are currently my parents' house and their guest house. They are only 20 feet apart, or about the distance of a single-lane grave road. It was in my parents' house, cooking something. My house was the guest house since it doesn't have a kitchen or anything, so I used my parents' house for cooking and showering. No one but myself was living on the property at the time. Okay, to the story. I was cooking. I heard the house shake. I'm not sure how to otherwise explain it, but it sounded like the corner of the house shook, kind of like a dog had just shook it right after getting out of the water. Well, coincidentally, there is a creek right next to my house. So I walk into the living room from the kitchen on my way to the front door to check what's going on. I don't see anything. I looked outside and didn't hear anything moving. I was about to close the door and the cat comes in. Strange, I thought, but at the same time it didn't faze me too much. It's a cat. They come in at all hours of the night. Well, sooner than later, my food was done and I wanted to go back to my house so I could watch TV. As I was walking across the road, I noticed a figure off to my left, so I turned to look at it, and there stands this 5 foot tall. The ears on this thing stood straight up and were about shoulder height on me, and I'm 5'11". It was essentially a German shepherd, from what I could tell, standing regular like a dog would, but its eyes glowed red. It was a complete silhouette of the animal, so I didn't see any features, but it definitely had the build of a German shepherd. It didn't move. It just stared directly at me, 10 feet away. I darted into my house to grab my shotgun, and I came back outside to find it was gone. No sound, no signs of movement, just gone. I fired off a couple of rounds in case it was still around somewhere, but it was gone. My parents want me to believe it was just a coyote. Coyotes aren't built that beefy. This thing was huge and buff, like pit bull breed to kill buff, and Great Dane tall. Most accurate description of the animal I can give you. Glowing red eyes, vertical pointed ears, thick head, round like a pit bull, but German shepherd shape, thick body. I couldn't see anything below the chest. I was just too focused on its eyes. But it did look like it had legs and was standing on the ground. It was also unnaturally still. Hello all. I had an experience to me when I was around 12-13 that I had forgotten about until it recently came up in conversation with family. It's about a creature I saw at my grandparents' property. To set the landscape, my grandparents live on an 8-acre plot of rectangular land that is gradually sloping upward the whole way. The top half is entirely woods, with the house sitting just below the tree line, giving a pretty good view to the rest of the property below. About 300 yards from the house is an old shed with a creek behind it. The shed sits near a fence/property line, and on the other side is a farm that used to be much bigger, but at the time only had 4 to 5 cows roaming around. So I was sitting on a swing on my grandparents' porch, alone, just relaxing and looking at the fields below. Off to my left, towards the shed, I noticed this gray-white animal with black spots here and there, walking on all 4 legs. Immediately, I thought it was one of the cows, as they were known to sometimes cross the fence into the yard. I got up to go tell my grandfather. When I looked back to watch where the cow was walking to, it then walked to the shed, raised itself off its front legs only onto its back legs, and just leaned on the shed. I thought it was odd until it turned its head in my direction. Even with the distance between us, I got immediate chills and this overpowering feeling that I just knew it somehow was staring right at me. I turned around and ran into the house, told my grandfather, and came back outside. It was no more than 1 minute from the time I left to was back outside, and it was gone. No trace of it, and no cows anywhere near the fence. I told my grandfather what I saw it do, and he chuckled, told me that's a nice imagination, and was the end of it. It terrified me so much of the time that I tried to put it out of my mind, but I still get goosebumps just thinking about it. Does this sound familiar to anyone? In March 2015, I woke up at around 3 in the morning. I have no idea why. Usually I wake up to drink water or use the bathroom, but I needed neither of those things. Anyway, I was living in Southern California at the time, near Camp Pendleton, and where I lived there was my neighborhood, then just wilderness. There was nothing beyond my neighborhood for miles, just land. Just an FYI, I have always been into the supernatural, but I don't think I really believed it until this experience. Before I went to sleep, I opened my window because it was hot, and I had my curtains open and my shades open, and I pulled them up to make sure air was able to get in. So at 3 a.m., I woke up and just looked out my window, which was next to my bed, and I thought I saw somebody standing at the crosswalk across the street. I was just thinking, that's so weird, because usually we didn't have runners or early morning wakers until about 5. So I got up and went to my window so I could get a closer look at what I saw. But I will never forget what I saw. This thing was standing, but its legs were bent and it had some white fur covering the body. However, I could still see some skin. Its back was hunched over and its face looked like some sort of dog's. If this creature was standing straight up, I'd say that it would be about 7 or 8 feet tall. Now, mind you, this was at 3 a.m., so I was just like, wow, okay, you're hallucinating. Go back to sleep. However, I was literally paralyzed and could not take my eyes off of this creature. Its nose and ears just looked so similar to a dog's or some sort of wolf or coyote. Where I lived, coyotes were very prevalent. However, they never ever really came into the neighborhood. And for anyone that says it could have been a bear, there are no bears in the area that I lived in because it was such a warm, desert-like climate. So as you can tell, I was just completely shocked and nervous, and I was able to shut my window. The thing turned its head and stared right at me. It was standing directly under a streetlight, so I could see its features pretty clearly, and its eyes were just so black. But somehow they were shining to where you could really see them staring right into your soul. That did it for me. I slammed my window shut, pulled down the blinds, closed the curtains, and jumped right into bed while pulling the covers over my face. I never went back to sleep that night. Flash forward 2 years later, in June of 2017, I again woke up, but this time I was just hungry. So I went downstairs to get some food and sat at my kitchen table. In the chair that I sat, my back was facing the window on the side of the house. This window was about a foot off the ground and it was open about 10 inches because my mom forgot to shut it. Now, that window had no screen because it got torn somehow, and we just didn't get around to replacing it yet. Anyway, I had my earbuds in and was watching a movie or show. I can't exactly remember, but I heard a noise. I couldn't tell if it was from the movie or from outside, so I paused and listened. I then heard heavy breathing, but I have never heard this kind of breathing before, and it was coming directly behind me, right outside the window. The breathing was rough, rigid, and sounded anything other than a human. I was too scared to turn around and face it, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I had goosebumps everywhere. The breathing lasted for about 2 minutes. Then I heard heavy footsteps, as if this thing was walking away. After about 10 minutes had passed, I shut the window, locked it, closed the curtains, and ran up to my room. I told my parents about my first encounter the next day after it happened. I was 16 at the time and still living with mom and dad. They just kind of looked at me and laughed and said I was seeing things and that it was probably just a coyote. After my second encounter, I told them the next day, and that time they really thought I was just tired and was hearing things. My question to everybody out there is, have any of you experienced something similar to this? Was this just a coyote, or do you guys think I was hallucinating? It's been really bothering me for a while now, and I've been really wanting to get my story out there because I cannot deal with no answers.